Hello, how are you going?
Yeah, good, thanks. Good morning, Dr. Karl. Thank you so
Good,
much for
Carl.
being here.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Cheers for being here with WA Forest Alliance today to talk about your new book, Dr. Karl's Little Book of Climate Change Science.
That's the
It's really
one.
good. I've been reading it all week, and I really like how you've made such a complicated subject so digestible. What prompted you to write it?
The fact that I wrote my very first book, or my very first story on climate change science back in 1981. And in fact, in 1975, I read that the insurance companies had already recognized that this thing that they call the greenhouse effect was actually happening. And so they were just charging more money for insurance premiums in zones that were affected with more floods, etc. Nothing personal, it was just business. Now, that was in 1973 that Munich Re, the world's largest reinsurance company, saw that this thing we now call climate change was happening. It took the scientists a bit longer because they needed a higher burden of proof. That took them till 1990. I've been doing stories on it for 40 years. I've been talking about it all the time. I'm still doing it again. And the good news is that we can both stop and reverse global warming. We just need different politicians from the ones that we've got at the moment.
Yes, hear to that. You talk at the beginning of your book about a decades-long disinformation campaign to cover up, distract, and mislead people about the real facts of climate change. So, why do you think this disinformation campaign exists, and what does it look like?
Well, it's been going since 1990. So surprisingly, we've been trying to understand climate and the weather since the 1600s when the Medicis in Europe started doing stuff. But a lot of really good research was done in the 70s and 80s, funded, wait for it, by the fossil fuel companies who then covered it up later. In 1990, roughly two things happened. The climate scientists said that global warming was real, or greenhouse effect, and that we caused it, and the fossil fuel companies started covering it up. Spending, so that was 3 decades ago, spending up to $1 billion a year in telling lies, misinformation, and nothing personal. It was just business. They wanted to stay in business selling fossil fuels. They could have gone into staying as energy companies, but with a different mix, not just getting carbon-based fuels out of the ground and burning them, but going into a different mix. But some of them would have done well, but for some of them, they might have gone under, and they decided to take the easy way of just covering up and telling lies. Nothing personal, it's just business. Like the best example of that is big alcohol. Now, did you see their ads in every hospital in Australia in August
I didn't.
2018?
What do they look like?
Well, it was a picture of a pregnant woman standing sideways, and across her belly, this was a huge A0 poster, huge, in every hospital in Australia. And across her belly, it was said, "It is not known if drinking alcohol is harmful to the unborn baby of a pregnant woman."
How
Now,
is I thought it was just common knowledge that any amount of alcohol is bad.
it is, and they were just telling a lie. Now, it wasn't as though big alcohol specifically really wanted to have a whole bunch of malformed, mentally retarded babies being born. That was not their goal. But there was this group of people called pregnant women who, following the science, did not drink alcohol. And this was cutting into their sales. And that's why they did it. That's why they went out and put these lies, and it's been known for decades. That's why they put these lies on every poster, in every hospital in Australia, just to cover up the truth and get people to try to drink alcohol and increase their sales deliberately. The mentally retarded, malformed babies, that was just collateral damage. And so why is big fossil fuel doing it? For the same reason. Nothing personal, it's just business. They just want to stay making lots of money. And the tragedy is that a small number of companies, fewer than 90, are responsible for 2/3 of all the world's greenhouse emissions. Oh, by the way, just how it works is that the heat that we're getting from global warming is not the heat of combustion, from burning the fossil fuels. There is some, but it's microscopic. Basically, it's because the things that burning carbon creates, the greenhouse gases, they act like a one-way valve. The temperature of the sun, 5,700 degrees. Temperature of the ground, about 20. So the heat from the sun comes in at a short wavelength, 700 to 3,000 nanometers, and it just goes straight through the carbon dioxide. But when it comes from the ground, which is a lot cooler, 20 degrees, the heat comes up at around 10,000 nanometers, and at that temperature, it runs into the carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide acts like a one-way valve. That's the bottom line. Carbon dioxide acts like a one-way valve, and it traps heat in the atmosphere. How much? 400,000 Hiroshima bombs per day.
Wow.
Not per week, per day. And you can get away with that for a day or a week or a month or a year or even a decade. But you do it for several decades, and you end up in our current situation, which was that for Australia in 2020, 1/5 of all the forests burnt. 2021, over on the East Coast, we had an unprecedented set of storms due in part to global warming. Certainly the extra air temperature meant that you could have 7% more water in the air, plus the water temperature was warmer, thus feeding the storm. And what happened was that over Warragamba Dam in one day, the amount of water flowing over was roughly equal to what all of the Sydney Basin uses in an entire year.
Well, that's the thing, Dr. Karl. We're starting to see many more extremes in our weather patterns in recent years, aren't we? And it's quite scary, and it's something that's going to continue to increase. So, yeah,
But
in
we
your
can
book,
reverse it. We can reverse it. We can both
yes.
stop and reverse global warming. And that's part of the disinformation campaign that the big fossil fuel companies are doing to try and make you think it's too late. There's no point. They're wrong. They're lying again.
So, in your book, you talk about the role that greenhouse gases play in causing the Earth's temperature to rise. So, can you speak to how forests can help mitigate this causal relationship?
Sure. Forests are based on carbon, trees. So suppose you get a pot of dirt, say 100 kilograms, and you put a little tiny shoot in it, a little seed, come back 5 years later, you've got a tree trunk like this, and you pull the tree out of the soil and you brush off all the dirt still weighs 100 kilograms. Where did the atoms in the tree come from? Well, the tree's mostly made of glucose, cellulose. And so the carbon and the oxygen atoms came out of the atmosphere into the tree, and the hydrogen atoms came out of the water. And so trees have got a really big role to play in just simply in pulling carbon dioxide out of the air. And that's not just trees on land. We're also talking the Great Southern Reef, which is this amazing underwater forest of kelp that goes halfway around Australia from middle on the left to Karratha, all the way down across the bottom to middle on the right up to Byron Bay, 8,000 kilometres. 8,000 kilometres, about 1/5 of the way around the world, and you've got 70% of the Australian population living within 50 kilometres of this huge underwater forest, which pulls carbon dioxide out of the air at about 15 times the rate of a wheat field. So putting forests back on land can pull a significant amount of carbon dioxide out of the air, but also it improves the environment and it cools it down. I mean, you've been in a city on a hot day, and the shade under a tree is a lot cooler than the shade of a building. We need more trees, man.
Yeah. And at WA Forest Alliance, that we sing that song all day long. Yeah. The more trees, the better.
Yeah,
And
but
the
the
more
thing is
old
that
trees, the
the only
better
way
as
you'll
well.
Yeah, surprisingly, old trees can hold and put on more carbon than the younger trees. Now, the younger trees look like they're growing really fast, like they grow from this to 10 meters tall and from this to this wide. But there's a thing called the squared cubed relationship. And a tree this big, if it grows from that to that, it can put on more carbon than a tree growing from that to that. And so the old trees are really important, and not just for their carbon potential, but the fact that they support this amazing ecosystem. But we're not going to change it unless we change the politicians. The politicians that we have at the moment are not fit for purpose.
So you give a breakdown in the book of which human activities are generating what proportion of emissions across the globe. You do this so we can start to think about how we can change the way we do things to reduce these emissions. And you say that land clearing and the timber industry currently cause 6% of emissions annually. So that's taking into account that planting trees is counted as negative emissions. So what harmful effects does deforestation have besides for causing emissions then?
What harmful effects? Loss of biodiversity. Oh my God. Well over half of all of our drugs come from nature. And we're destroying nature. It's like somebody saying, hey, in that house over there, there's a painting by Van Gogh, it's worth $100 million. Let's set fire to it. We are so foolish. We need these plants, not just because of the richness of the biodiversity for the future, but in the short term, just simply we need stuff like medications. And the role of the trees in the importance of our quality of life, even air temperature, is so huge. So with regard to parking lots around supermarkets, air temperatures have been measured of 70 degrees centigrade on really hot days. Like,
Wow.
for example, 70 degrees centigrade. So on the 4th of January, in the year 2020, the hottest place on the entire planet was Sydney, 48.9 degrees. But at a
Wow.
parking lot, but on a parking lot, they measured higher than that, because the way you measure temperature in the air is in a thing called a Stevenson box, which is where you have the thermometers, and around them you have a box, maybe, about a meter by a meter, with a shaded roof and louvers to let the air in, so you're not getting direct sunlight on them, and you have it in the shade. In the parking lot, it's really bad. And what they've discovered is that if you have just one or two trees every 30 meters, it cools down the whole parking lot enormously. So that means that 70 goes down to 55. But then that means you've missed out on, 5 parking spots. Oh, horror. The more trees, the better. I can't see a downside to having trees.
Yeah, and we obviously know that the worsening bushfires, heat waves, drought, decline in rainfall in WA alone, up to 25% in some areas since the mid-1970s have declined in rainfall. And more than 50% of that has been attributed to land clearing of the forests. So yeah, it's that they're clearly an asset that humanity needs.
Yeah, I did a story on this about 25 years ago, about how in some parts of Western Australia down in the Great Southern, you have land clearing along a long fence on one side but not the other, and the air temperature and the rainfall was very different just over that range. Like by the time you got half a kilometre each side, there was a world of difference. And we knew this 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah. So in your eyes, then you've been speaking about these politicians, you've been speaking about these billion-dollar disinformation campaigns. What can we do to stop this issue? What can we do to fix it? Because we need answers and we need them fast.
Well, there is an old saying that all you need for evil to triumph is that good people do nothing. Here's a question for you. Have you personally ever run for a seat in politics?
I have not, no.
In that case, you deserve everything that happens to you. Right? In my case, I actually ran for a seat in politics.
Did
And
you?
failed. Yeah.
Where?
In 2007 for the federal Senate. And out of the 782,000 votes needed to get into the Senate, I fell very short. I got only 42 or 44,000 votes under the line, if you know what that means. And that apparently is still a record. And if you don't know what under the line means, then you don't understand politics, and you pretty well deserve everything that happens to you. So either run for politics or vote for somebody or support somebody who'll do for you what you want. Politics, P for politics, P for power. And if somebody says, why don't you run for politics? And you go, oh, I wouldn't do that because they're all dishonest. You've immediately made sure that the dishonest people stay in power with no opposition.
Well, I really think as well that information is power. And, things like your book, it's succinct information, it's empowering people with the facts, with the knowledge. And when you have the right knowledge, when you understand that there are issues, then you can begin to do something about them. If you're stuck in the disinformation and the misinformation, you can't really fix an issue if you don't even know it's there in the first place.
That is true. And as a result of that, I've been involved in several peaceful, non-violent street demonstrations. Have you ever been in a street demonstration?
I've been present at many, yes.
Have you actually walked down the street?
Yeah, I have.
It was
Yeah,
yeah.
it's a pretty empowering feeling actually being with your community and chanting all at the same time. It's yeah, it's a lot of fun and it feels meaningful at the same time.
Well, with regard to one aspect of it, it stopped the United States from using atom bombs on Vietnam. In his autobiography, Nixon, the US president, describes how he was getting ready to drop atom bombs on North Vietnam. And there was
Wow.
a demonstration of 250,000 people around the White House at Washington, D.C., who got their fair share of abuse, got beaten up and then went home. And they all thought they'd failed. But Nixon was so impressed by the power of 250,000 people that he decided to not drop bombs on North Vietnam, which has changed the world enormously. Secondly, I've been involved in various peaceful, non-violent street demonstrations of civil disobedience over the years. So I walked in the streets against nuclear weapons, and we've gone from 60,000 down to only a few thousand. I protested at the Springbok tour of Australia against apartheid in South Africa. And eventually, as a result of me and not just me, but millions of people around the world doing it, Nelson Mandela got let out of jail. I protested against the Vietnam War. I protested that in the streets that Indigenous Australians be allowed to be counted in the census. Because back then, you counted cattle, but you didn't count Indigenous Australians, and to even be allowed to vote. And so in each of those cases, was I a ratbag or was I on the right side of history? At the time, you don't know. But in retrospect, I was on the right side of history. And with regard to climate change, I'm pretty sure I'm on the right side of history there. We're being held back by this massive $1 billion a year disinformation campaign. But I think I'm very confident we'll win. We can stop and reverse global warming.
Well, just last year, just after the summer bushfires that were really terrible, we had 100,000 people across Australia walk on the streets and across the globe as well, with people like Greta Thunberg inspiring heaps of people, an unprecedented amount of people to take to the streets and say, we want action on climate change. So that does give me a hope in a lot of ways that the youth especially are really passionate about this and are ready to, say, maybe one day of the year, I'm not going to go to school and I'm going to go do something else, which is protest my government for harming the planet, which I think is a very powerful and effective tool.
And also run for politics and don't vote for the people who don't do what you want.
Yeah, well, in terms of that, you said in chapter 8, titled "What's the Fix?" you talked about the failures of our current economic system, and you talk about this throughout the book as well. You say in one example that our current economic system values a dead tree higher than a living one. So, in what ways do you think our current economic system is hurting our environment then?
Part of the problem is, on one hand, we do have this field of knowledge called economics, but then very few politicians have any qualifications whatsoever in economics. And even if they do, just because it suits their needs, they'll quote something called the gross domestic product, the GDP. And they say, we've always got to increase the GDP. Well, when you have a cyclone going into a city and destroying every single building, believe it or not, that increases the GDP.
Really?
The GDP is a flawed measure that was invented around the time of the Second World War to try and work out the economic activity of the USA, what was being manufactured and what was being sold and what was being bought. At no stage did it measure the overall well-being. It just simply measured how much was being spent. And so if a cyclone comes down and destroys every building in Perth, those buildings have to be rebuilt, which improves the GDP. If you employ a whole lot of people to dig a hole in the ground and another bunch of people to fill them in, that improves the GDP. When they invented the GDP, the economists said, under no circumstances use this for anything other than just measuring how many dollars are being spent. And somehow it's being turned into, by politicians who have very little economic training, into an overall measure of how well or how good the well-being is in a country. So straight away, we're dealing with a flawed economic measure. I've done a podcast on this with Richard Dennis, Dennis. Follow his work. He's written in The Conversation and other places, Dennis, and he's written a wonderful book called Econobabble. So at one stage, somebody high in politics in Australia said, well, the reason that we're having problems with getting enough of the vaccine is supply chain problems. And what they meant to say was, we didn't pay enough. But they wouldn't say that. And so there's a great deal of econobabble. So you might hear, for example, a report on the news that the stock market responded unfavorably to the increase in renewable energy. What that means is that some wealthy foreign investors didn't like the increase in solar cell panels, etc. So you read that book, Econobabble, and then you'll see through the misinformation, disinformation, taking out of context that many politicians use. Now, let me point out here that one of the great discoveries I made while running for politics was that the political label really doesn't matter that much. What matters is the person and the people. So in Australia, we have a situation where the Conservative political party does not accept the science of climate change, but the non-Conservative party does. In England, it's the other way round. So what's more important than the label is the person and their policies.
Okay. Just one thing you said before. You said if a tornado destroys a city, then their GDP goes up. Does that mean the 2019-2020 summer bushfires raised our GDP as well?
If they destroyed enough houses, yes, that would have been good for the economy.
Wow. That is a flawed system if such a tragedy can be good for the economy. And then people like our Prime Minister can boast, we have such a high GDP right now because of it. That's crazy.
Well, let me give you an example. Here's another example of GDP. Now, think about Australia. Here we are, continent, this side of the equator. Okay, now let's think about another country on the other side of the equator. Russia. Big country, lots of people, nuclear weapons. They've got a space program. They've got access, they launch stuff into space. They've got supersonic jet fighters. They've got army and navy and air force. And they've got nuclear-powered submarines and nuclear weapons and aircraft carriers. Question, how much bigger is their GDP than Australia's, do you think? Have a guess.
About 3 times bigger?
1/4.
What?
Yeah, it's virtually the same as Australia's, depending on the exchange rate. But we spend our money on other things which might not be good for the common good. So I don't know if you realize this, But last year you spent about $2,300. You gave it away as a subsidy to a fossil fuel company. Did anybody tell you that?
Is that through
You did?
superannuation?
No, the government, the federal government. So what happens in this,
Oh, okay.
if you look at all of the revenue that all of the governments make around the world, they give 8% of that to the fossil fuel companies as a present, not an investment. There's no money given back as a subsidy. It's just a present. Now, 8%, mate, that's more than our military budget.
That's crazy.
We are giving away so much money. And then if you read the 2019 International Monetary Fund report that I quote, and by the way, the International Monetary Fund, they are hard-nosed economic people. So if they say, look, gee, your country needs to get rid of all free education just to get you out of this bad thing in the short term, I mean, they're really hard-nosed people. And they said that firstly, 8% of all government revenue around the world is given to fossil fuel companies for free. And secondly, you're thinking, well, but at least we've got, like a robust economy. And they said, no, it's actually bad for the economy and has made the economy go backwards. It has not done good things for the economy. It's done bad things for the economy. And this is the International Monetary Fund. It's somewhere in my book there. Read it up.
So you're saying that these fossil fuel companies get a large proportion of taxpayer money every year. Does that mean taxpayers are then technically paying to be lied to through this disinformation that the fossil fuel companies are funding?
Yes.
Wow.
And the latest, and the latest example of that, are you familiar with the latest moves on a federal level to charge everybody with solar panels for
I'm
putting
not, no.
electricity into the grid? Oh no, this came through last week. Well, you're in Western Australia and you have a remarkably monopolistic newspaper situation. So you probably
We do,
read,
yes.
yeah, you read about the AFL, you didn't read about this. So the move is that anybody who's putting electricity into the grid is charged for it. They have to
Wow.
pay for the privilege of putting electricity into the grid, which is then sold back to them at up to 50 cents a kilowatt hour. And I was thinking that I could kind of go along with that if it was equal for everybody, in the sense that if I pull into a servo to buy liquid hydrocarbons for my car, they should pay me money to fill my petrol tank. If I have to pay to give energy to give electricity to somebody, they should pay me for taking that fuel off their hands.
Wow, that's
yeah, that's
backwards.
what I mean about how in Australia at the moment, the overwhelming majority of the politicians are not fit for purpose. It is perfectly clear that we're heading into a climate change crisis. Now, 1 degree hotter gives us 20% of all the forests in Australia burning, and at the other extreme, massive rains. So we get 1 day's worth of overflow of the dam equal to 1 year's worth of human consumption. So on one hand, we're getting these terrible economic and bad social effects happening to us just with 1 lousy degree up. But 4 degrees down, cooler globally, gives you 3 kilometers of ice over Montreal. The atmosphere is very, very sensitive. The whole system is very sensitive. So 1 degree is 1/4 of 4 degrees, and 4 degrees down gives you 3 kilometers of ice over Montreal. We are playing with a system that we don't fully understand. And the trouble is that or what's good for us so far is there's a bit of inertia in the system. So it takes a while for these effects to swing in, and we can in fact stop and reverse them with a whole bunch of things. So we can pull carbon dioxide out of the air. So go to the website drawdown.org in the USA, a whole bunch of climate scientists there. And there's a whole bunch of things that we can do, ranging from fully biological, I know it sounds weird, plant forests, right? And you can get the kelp going in the oceans, and you can do biochar, and it ranges from the methods of pulling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They range from fully biological to fully military industrial. So there's a company called Climeworks, ClimeWorks, and they just brutally pull carbon dioxide out of the air. And if you had 40 million of their machines, if you built them once, 40 million machines, that would each year, forever after, pull out 1 year's worth of human carbon dioxide production out of the air. But you're thinking, hang on, 40 million is an impossibly large number. Mate, it's half of the number of new cars we make each year. If we went without new cars for 6 months, we could start pulling a year's worth of human carbon dioxide out of the air and bring carbon dioxide levels back. And you know what the only thing stopping us is the fact that you personally did not run for politics last year. It's all your fault.
So lastly, do you think Australians, let alone the world, are able to band together and overcome this challenge of climate change? Are you an optimist or what?
Oh yeah. As it gets more and more expensive, people say, "Oh my God, it's actually right here, right now, costing us lots of money." So the International Monetary Fund can see that subsidising fossil fuel companies is just in the short term bad for the economy. But once it starts getting bigger and bigger, and it ends up going bad by a factor of 10, then people say, "Oh, okay, right, it is bad for the economy. Let's do something about it." And we should have done it years ago, but it's not too late. I'm an optimist. We can do it, we will do it. And all we need is people to plant more trees and become politically active. Remember, all that is needed for evil to triumph is that good people do nothing.
Certainly. And what's better than planting trees is not knocking them down in the first place, of course.
Yeah, I actually I put in some Purple King or Purple Republican climbing beans, which I love to pieces. But the massive storm just hammered them. I've never seen this before. So they actually died when they were about this far out of the ground. Just days and days of massive rain and massive winds. I've never seen this before. So now I'm stuck with putting a bit of a greenhouse around them. But that means I'll be able to keep growing more into winter. So it's a happy ending in that sense.
Okay, nice. Well, thank you so much for speaking with us here at WA Forest Alliance today, Dr. Karl. It really means a lot. Where can we get your book, Dr. Karl's book of climate change science?
Online? Yeah, you can get it from Booktopia or just from a physical bookshop. Actually, I would tend to, on one hand, support Booktopia or the like, online, because that way you can get it fairly quickly. But on the other hand, I would also support the local bookshop because you can go in there. And the advantage of the bookshop is you walk up and down the aisles and then suddenly you see something you had no idea was there. And then you just take it off the shelf and you flip through it and think, I really like this. And that's what I like. I like the surprise of discovering something I didn't expect. So support your local bookshop as well.
Okay, awesome. So yeah, thank you so much and have a nice day, sir. It was good to talk to you.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Dr. Shaquille. Is that how you pronounce it? S-H-A-Q-U-I-L-L?
Yeah, Shaquille. Yeah.
Ah,
Sorry,
are you
just
named after
quickly,
the...
sir, what's your background?
This is
Spaceship.
this is the holodeck of the Enterprise, but I can give you a different background. Let's find another background for you. I've got a variety of them. Here's a... hang on, where is it now? Oh, here we go. Yeah, let's get this over here. Then, of course, there's this shameful advertising here. There's, hey, I'm a party man. Hey, party, party, party. And there's this one that I shot down in the Antarctic a few years ago.
Wow.
That's midnight.
Midnight.
Yeah, that's midnight in Antarctica.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I bet that was freezing cold.
It was only about down to about -5, -10. And in fact, just this year, oh, now have a look at this. See the bulb on the front of the ship?
Wow.
Yeah. So that's me up there at the top in that little area at the middle of the bow of the ship. There's a little black thing. There's a hole there. I've got my camera pointed through that, pointing down at the ground, at the water, looking at the reflection at the bottom of the ship and not able to see what I'm shooting with my bare hands because otherwise I couldn't hold the camera steady because I couldn't feel it properly. And then I'd shoot stuff for about 10 minutes and come inside, warm up, and then go back and try and get it right. So it took me a couple of hours to get this. Look how flat it is there. This is midnight, just quietly ghosting our way past the little icebergs there.
Wow. Well, okay, Dr. Karl, really good to talk to you. Thanks so much. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shaquille. See you later. Bye-bye.
See ya. Bye.